today we will turn around, even if a little bit carefully, and sort of delve into AI, and particularly the intersection of social science and AI, exploring its transformative impact on research and obviously policy making and public understanding. And our speakers will illuminate the role of AI in social research, sort of in health, epidemiology, and statistical analysis, and highlighting some of the ethical considerations and the need for responsible innovation. So we hope you find the talk enlightening, and in terms of AI's potential to shape our world and our understanding of it. Before I do introduce them, I'm just reminded of one other thing, which is the fire regulations, and there is no fire alarm due today. I've actually myself already experienced a real fire alarm earlier at my work, and so I certainly don't want two in one day, not on a cold night tonight. If it does go, it will be unfortunately a real one, so please make your way to the nearest entrance, which will either be behind you or the one to your left. And the meeting point, I'm told, is by a tree over in that direction, which will hopefully become obvious, unless the tree, I suppose, is the cause of the fire. But anyway, let's hope that's not the case. We have three distinguished speakers: Professor Helen Margetts, Dr. Nicola Stingelin, and Andrew Banks, who will give themselves a better introduction than I'm able to. So I'm going to, without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Helen, who will talk about what social science can do for AI.
Thanks very much. Thanks, everybody. It's great to be here. I actually think that I've cheated a bit, because I actually think I was asked to talk about what AI can do for social science. And I do spend a lot of time thinking about that and kind of practicing that, as it were. It's a huge part of what I do. But I wanted to talk about it the other way round, because I think the question of what social science can and sort of must do for AI is a more urgent question. So I'm going to try and convince you of that, and I will give a few examples from kind of my where I come from, that is these two places. I should say, so I'm a professor at the Oxford Internet Institute at the University of Oxford, and I also set up and direct the public policy programme at the Alan Turing Institute. And both those organisations are deeply multidisciplinary to the core. And I should point out that when I talk about social science, I'm quite often talking about multidisciplinarity, but we take it very much for granted that when we talk about AI, we need statistics, we need mathematics, we need engineering, we need computer science, and a whole host of other things as well. And indeed, those are the core disciplines that we were brought together to form the Alan Turing Institute. But I'm a social scientist, and I do feel that social science is the kind of set of disciplines that very often gets forgotten in AI. People have just managed to get hold of the idea that the humanities might be there, because we've heard all this stuff about creativity and ChatGPT ruining the future of art and creativity. And we've heard about ethics and the kind of philosophy of the ethics of AI, but social science often gets kind of left out, and that's why I wanted to talk about it. Have I got how do I? There we are. So just a word about the Turing Public Policy Programme. So when the Alan Turing Institute was set up, lots of universities bid to be kind of founding partners in the institute, one of which was my own university, Oxford. And Oxford is a deeply decentralised university. It's got colleges and then it's got departments. And being head of department, as I then was, is a bit like running a small business. You're kind of responsible for the budget, and you have to make your money and kind of do deals and that kind of thing. It's very odd. And anyway, there were 5 departments that came together, and they were exactly the ones I said: statistics, computer science, economics. Sorry, not economics. What am I talking about mathematics and engineering. And I was the only social scientist who kind of wanted to be part of the party. And I guess in those days, I was indeed the only social scientist who had so much to do with the Turing at that time. And I did go to the Turing leadership and say, look, I think as part of the National Institute for Data Science and AI, we should have part of the institute that thinks about AI from a sort of public good perspective. Most AI is developed by the private sector for the private sector, or at least that's what it was sort of historically. And I thought there should be one part, and this is the public policy program. That was in 2018. Since that time, it has grown gradually, and I fondly believe strategically, to be round about 55 researchers with affiliated researchers across the university sector, and increasingly with public sector organisations, government departments and so on. We do secondments with each other. 20 other universities, we've run a whole host of projects. But what we're most proud of is that we've worked with over 100 public sector organisations. That could be government departments, it could be international organisations, or it could be local governments. We work a lot with local governments, and we particularly work with regulators. And we believe to do that, you need all those sorts of disciplinary expertise. And there's a ... at the end, because I'm always discovering that we've got, we've got someone else who has a particularly distinctive blend of expertise that includes something that we've not had before. The Oxford Internet Institute, as I said, is equally multidisciplinary, and that includes right across the social sciences, but also across other departments of the University of Oxford. And we run degrees in social data science, postgraduate degrees in social data science, which are a collaboration with some of the departments I've mentioned. So that's what I think you need to really think about AI. And in particular, to think about the relationship between AI and society. Okay, AI is great, right? But does it really matter if it doesn't affect anybody or anything in the world? No, really, the important thing about AI is its relationship with people. Does it make people's lives better, or does it make them worse by making them feel unsafe, for example? These are really important questions which I think you need this kind of multidisciplinary research. So here's one example. It's a report we wrote for the Office for AI and a couple of the largest regulators 2 or 3 years ago now. It's called, it was mentioned in the government white paper on regulation. It's called Common Regulatory Capacity for AI because that's what it is about. AI is having a transformative effect on almost every market, every area of society. So every regulator, although they don't think of themselves like that, is actually now a technology regulator. Even organisations like the Equality and Human Rights Commission, for example, who really wouldn't see that as their core competency originally. How can you regulate rights in the workplace, for example, at Uber, if you can't get a handle on what their algorithm does and how it shapes workers' lives in that organisation? And that applies right across the field to almost every regulator. Some of the biggest regulators have got huge expertise now in data science, but the smaller ones really are kind of struggling. That was what that report was about. But it raises, just starting with one of my own disciplines, I'm a political scientist actually, and one of my most long-running specialisms is in public administration and the structure of government and the design of public management reform. And really, when you think about common capacity in AI for regulators, you have to think, where am I going to put that? Where does that fit in the structure of government? And for example, we've just had the announcement of the government has announced the AI Safety Institute, but that's an organisation right outside government in some sense, with very few lines of accountability. How do you draw lines of accountability to expertise in AI, and how do you make it available right across a whole sector like the regulators? That's just a paper I wrote about that. Much to my surprise, it's a paper in a journal called Public Policy and Administration, but I was actually invited to present it, along with some work we're doing on productivity, to the Chief Secretary of the Treasury 2 or 3 weeks ago, because they were so interested in this question of kind of where you put essential expertise and capacity like that. And the reason for that, as I said in the previous slide, is that's because AI is a horizontal technology getting into everything. On the other hand, AI is also a vertical technology. It presents distinct opportunities and challenges in different sectors, and you need to understand that through different disciplinary mixes. So we do quite a lot of work on economic modelling, for example. The dominant discipline there is economics. There's lots of others, but you need some expertise in economics. You need domain expertise. You can't think about AI in education without some domain expertise. After all, the implications of, for example, large language models in education are really distinctive. Questions of assessment, questions of accountability of edtech providers, question of keeping capacity for policymakers, then being able to think about LLMs and education. All these are really important questions. You need domain expertise, and you need different kinds of social science expertise. Another thing you need is if you're going to understand the relationship between AI and society, you need actually to think about the kind of science of understanding what people think. And I do think that most very technology-focused people seem to think this is a really, really easy thing to do. You just ask a few people, and it frequently happens to me, even at the Noble University of Oxford. I will get somebody from one of the science departments saying, yes, well, we asked people, and that's not what they said. And you're like, how did you ask them? What did you, oh, well, we had a group, yes, they've got one of those companies, got some people, and we asked them. And then it turns out that there was something really obscure, like a really sort of special group of people of some kind, but that wasn't really thought to matter. You have to be able to ask people in a representative way and a nuanced and sophisticated way, because people's views of things like AI are very nuanced and sophisticated. People see concerns, they can see benefits. One of the things, this is a survey that we held with the Ada Lovelace Institute. It's a sample of 4,000 people. It took us about 6 months to design this survey. Unfortunately, we weren't in time for GPT, but we're working on sort of the next one already and thinking about the next one already. And of course, that will include large language models. But I like it as a sort of benchmark. And the important thing we thought here was to ask people about applications of AI that they had actually experienced or knew about, rather than asking people, as surveys so often do, kind of, what do you think about AI? What do you understand by AI? I could walk down the corridor in the Turing Institute, the National Institute for AI, and if I asked 5 people, I'd get at least 6 answers as to that. Why should we expect the public to know things we don't know ourselves? But what came out of this, by asking them about different applications that they might have experienced, like, I don't know, AI to make a decision on a loan or a benefit, that kind of thing, the use of AI as detecting risk in cancer, things that they would have heard of or experienced. And we found actually people were surprisingly positive. There's a huge amount of focus on existential risk and killer robots at the moment, but actually the public, basically do see the opportunities here, perhaps more than some of the policymakers or technologists, in fact. So for 17 of the uses we asked about, they were positive about 10 of them, particularly keen on AI for assessing the risk of cancer, perhaps as you might expect, had a lot of publicity in recent years. But they also saw concerns about that, even for kind of doctors and the cancer risk issue, or right across, but including that, 64% of people were worried about professionals relying too heavily on AI and losing professional expertise. There was more concern about robotics than other sorts of AI. Driverless cars, 72%. Autonomous weapons, well, you can understand that. But also robotic care assistants in hospitals and nursing homes, which a lot of tech companies are working very busily on, and they maybe should take a quick look at this data to see how people actually feel about it, which is not very happy. And then we did ask people, what would make you feel more comfortable about AI? And 62%, so a comfortable majority of people, said that they would be more comfortable if there were laws and regulations that prohibit certain uses of technologies. And of course, we don't have that many laws and regulations to prohibit the use of technologies. So that is a bit of a sort of, it's a sign to us that people want us to think about systems of governance and regulation. And also this normally rather dry issue of accountability, clear procedures for appealing to a human against an AI decision, 59%. So that's useful. That's one of the things that we try and build into everything that we do in the programme. And that's particularly true when it comes to the ethics of AI. Now, I know there's going to be a talk on that later, so I won't go into too much detail, but it's just to come back for a moment to that horizontal, vertical thing. There are horizontal ethical issues in AI, fairness, accountability, transparency. Those are things that come up over and over again when it comes to ethical frameworks for the development and deployment of AI. And there's an example of one of those kind of horizontal treatments. That was a report we did with the Information Commissioner's Office on explainability in AI, tackling this question of transparency of black box technology. Understanding ethical intelligence, ethics and safety, that's a long-running stream of work. It's still going on. There's lots of new reports coming out all the time. And that's about building a horizontal framework. That is the official government guidance for the ethical use of AI and safety. But then you've also got the vertical question. This is a very long-running piece of work with the Ministry of Justice, looking at an ethical framework for criminal justice and dealing with the specific issues there, because there are specific issues, just as there are in health, for example. So keeping that ethical and keeping that horizontal and vertical thing going. And also, of course, going all the way from values and principles, which we sort of kind of agree on, to actual practice and giving guidance to developers and those who deploy AI. One of the things that AI does is it holds up a mirror to ourselves. So we've always been biased. Humans are really biased. Anyone who's been on unconscious bias training course knows that we are sort of inherently biased, even when we don't want to be. But the data and the AI or the technology it just sort of exposes that by being trained on our previous decisions, which are basically human decisions, and the bias arising from that. It makes us realize how biased, for example, our hiring systems or our loan systems or our policing systems actually are. So it's making us think about things that we haven't talked about for ages. When did we last talk about the idea that, judges were very biased? How much did we talk about that before we had any decent data to talk about it? So I think that's an important point, and for any one of those concepts, transparency, how transparent is bureaucracy? How many people who know what really goes on in a government department? But now it's a technology and we know it's a black box, we've started worrying about it more. As a political scientist, I'm super pleased about that in a way, but obviously, of course, it's a challenge. Accountability too. And then these more kind of vertical issues here. Half of crime is online now. Over half of crime is online. What does policing mean in that context? But we haven't changed the way we think about policing for donkey's years. So it is or should be forcing us to do that. And I do think it's social science, it's economics, it's kind of the sociology of the professions and all sorts of concepts of governance that we need to be able to do that thinking. Polarization, democratic political systems are engines of polarization. Political parties are precisely that, getting people sort of different wings to come together. But we always blame it on social media, and now we're going to blame it on AI. It's coming just down the road. As Professor of Society and the Internet at Oxford, I'm particularly sensitive to the way that we blame everything on technology. And productivity, of course. We say that productivity is flat, but we're incredibly bad at measuring it. But now the ONS, for example, have done some really interesting new work on measuring productivity, and we're doing some work on the same issue. It's making us think about these things again. And just a couple of last points. Have I got a couple more minutes? Is that okay? Yeah, go ahead. What is social science good for? And I know there is resistance to this in the tech world, the idea that social science, the points I'm making are difficult to make in the tech world. So I'd just like to suggest a couple here. One of them is the ability to ask the right question. I don't know how many social scientists there are here who are involved in multidisciplinary teams, but I often find the problem when I'm working with the brilliant mathematicians and physicists and biologists and so on that I do work with, that sometimes we'll have young researchers doing really, really clever things, and quite often I'll have to ask, they'll tell me what they're doing to try, and I have to ask, why? Why are we doing that? Can you remember why are we doing that? Because if you can't, then, we have to ask, should we be doing it? And then there's the question to undertake normative work. I was giving a talk at quite a technical, sort of computational social science, but really on the mathematical side conference in Europe a couple of years ago. And at one point during I was giving a presentation on some of the work we do on hate speech classification and detection and measurement. And when I'd finished, some people liked it, okay? But this one mathematician sort of raised his hand and said, but to do what you're doing there, you have to define what is hate. And that's a normative question. And he looked at me as if I'd just sort of dumped a basket of rotting fish on the lectern, that I was doing something really dirty. And of course, that's what social scientists do. We like defining concepts. I would be happy to talk for hours about what is democracy, days. That's kind of what we're good at, it's what we're trained in, and I think that's really important. So I always get a bit worried when I hear that the tech companies are dedicating a certain percentage of their budgets to alignment. By alignment, they mean kind of alignment with human values. Well, what are human values? And should Elon Musk be working out what they are? I don't think so. I want to finish now because I don't want to go over time. This is some work we're doing on modelling for policy. The sort of dominant discipline, the people who are leading this work are economists. But it's really, we're starting to do it in other areas as well. The key argument here is that during the pandemic, there was a huge amount of talk of modelling and data science and AI, but it was all about epidemiology. It wasn't multidisciplinary, and there were very, very few sort of integrated models that tried to think about more than one thing at the same time, particularly economic modelling. So policy was being made in a vacuum. Really major policy interventions like the furlough scheme or, of course, locking down, closing schools, were being done in a sort of evidence-free zone. And this stream of work is really about kind of building the kind of models that we hope that people will use next time. The kind of models that bring economic data together with health data, for example, or tackle that question of labour mobility and labour flow networks and skills and so on that would be so crucial to a furlough scheme. Another piece of research is on the online safety bill. User controls are a major part, Act. 7 years later, we have an Act. The Online Safety Act puts a lot of weight on user controls, things like safety technology for blocking people and so blocking people, users protecting themselves on social media. The trouble is we know hardly anything about how people use these tools. This is a bit of behavioural science to try and understand under what circumstances people are minded to use those tools and kind of flag things as abuse, looking at in-groups and out-groups. Haven't got time to go into details, but I feel like that is a very valuable piece of research and could inform the design of these kind of technologies. Here's a piece of political science. That's a paper with my PhD student. Been a huge amount of publicity about Sam Altman talking about how targeted, personalised advertising is going to destroy democracy. Well, this was just a little paper to look at an experiment, a large-scale experiment, well, not that large, not as large as we would have liked, but quite large, and we're doing another one now, to show the influence of personalised advertising using GPT-4 versus a kind of best message. And actually, it didn't actually make any difference. I'm not saying GPT-4 won't make any difference, but its best message is so good that actually the targeting doesn't improve on that. So that really makes us question this whole thing about personalised targeting. Is it really so wonderful? And we've just had, or just been another similar piece of work that has shown the same thing. So you need this kind of research to understand these kind of wild claims that are made for these technologies. You need I've made that point about multidisciplinary research. This is a paper kind of suggesting a kind of reform for the way we think about data science. And I'll just end by pointing to, this is the AI Safety Summit. Now, I was at the AI Safety Summit. I'm very happy to have been at the AI Safety Summit, and there were useful things about the summit. But I think this rather illustrates, I mean, this is the last day. I wasn't at the last day. I don't think there were very many academics at the last day. But these are kind of tech moguls. You'll perhaps recognise some of the faces, and some of them are more shady characters who you won't recognise. And then some handful of world leaders at the front. But I do believe that along with my colleague Sandra Vactor at the Oxford Internet Institute, I think we were the only social scientists at the summit. And I really think as we go forward in the future, there should be quite a lot more. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Professor Helen Margetts with some, maybe if I could call it some home truths about AI. So I will now just a reminder there will be an opportunity for questions at the end. So now I will hand over to Dr. Nicola Stingelin behind me there. Did I get it wrong?
Yeah, that's perfect. That's
Stingelin, okay. Who's ethics advisor at the University of Basel.
I've taken my talk very literally from the title, AI, a game changer for social research, ? Is it really or isn't it? I mean, it's also a normative, you could look at it from a normative way. Should it be a game changer? Should it not? So I've kind of looked at both aspects. And I'm saying game changer, I'm interpreting in a vaguely positive way. And a game changer might be negative. But I'm kind of saying, do we want it to change the game, or would it be good if it did, and how? An ethics perspective. I'm focusing vaguely on health field, epidemiology and public health, mostly public health. My initial response when I got the question was, I think, first of all, let's go back with my kind of training. Let's go back one step after another, premise, conclusion. We, of course, see a huge increase in accessible data from many sources, related to health. The question mark indicates that some of the data might be a bit questionable, if you're going to do it. But anyway, we've got all this data. We have increasing inputs from social research. Is vital to many aspects of health. I'll look into that. It's been acknowledged. We know this is vital. Who knows Michael Marmot's work? It is actually one of the most important things we can do for health and public health is social research. But anyway, we know, I think one can accept AI methods can positively support big data analysis. I think I'd say on the whole, yes. Therefore, I do think it has the potential to be a valuable tool in social research in health fields. But, of course, there's always a but, isn't there? Of course, subject to a number of ethical conditions being met, which Helen has already mentioned. So what I'm going to quickly do is look at the concepts, premises, definitions that I'm working with, look at these conditions, what are these ethical conditions, look at some practical examples of use of AI in public health, and a few concluding comments. Right, I mean, we haven't looked at what AI is. I mean, there are many definitions. It's a machine-based, it's important from the ethical point of view because it's making predictions, recommendations, decisions, vital in many fields, including the health field. It's a data-driven, the data is everything, developing algorithms. We all know what an algorithm is, and it needs sound data. I mean, I work as an advisor for the EU and EU projects, and people are doing so much bluffing about designing algorithms. I mean, it drives you mad, doesn't it? I say, well, how are you testing, evaluate? But it's really important that we do this correctly. Before developing an algorithm, there's all this new ground truthing. I mean, some of the terminology that's coming out is amazing, isn't it? We have to precisely define the problem and get the kind of data we need to validate the algorithm. Then the AI system's algorithm must be subjected to rigorous testing, validation, audit. So it's all data-driven. So that's one thing. Okay, so I've got a vague idea of what AI is. Health, of course. We know COVID really showed health is a web of determinants of physical, mental health, health inequalities. Michael Marmot's done such wonderful work on it. Data arising from COVID really revealed and reinforced, again, the interwoven causal relationship between this web of determinants that influence, shape health. The determinants, as you all know, are multiple, aren't they? They're social. We know how vital social are. They're the geographical, employment sector, ethnic, cultural, etc. The reason why I've highlighted the word causal, it's one of my big bugbears, and I am a bit worried about some AI. Just because you've got a lot of data doesn't mean you know what's going on, does it? And so often people don't differentiate between associations revealed by analysing data and where actual causalities are. And actually, I think we've got to be very careful not to over-expect what AI can deliver in that respect. So I think it's, So my original, hey, AI and social research, it's going to be great. And I started thinking, well, it's perhaps a bit more complex than I thought. And by the way, it's a question I've never looked at. And I'm really grateful for this chance. I've never looked specifically at AI algorithms for the social sciences. So I'm really kind of wow about this. These are the kind of thing we often see, all these social influences, socioeconomic, cultural, environmental, the individual lifestyle factors. I think nowadays we really appreciate that you can say individual lifestyle factors. Well, what's that really? Because so many lifestyle factors, most people who are sleeping in tents don't choose to sleep in tents. This lifestyle choice thing is a bit of a problematic expression, isn't it? But anyway, we must understand causalities, not just associations, when we start looking at this kind of modelling. What we must do is to acknowledge the influential role of social health determinants on health. And I would say almost therefore, for me, the vital role of social science in health, public health, research and practice. And I want to give you a quote from this document here, 2018, Public Health England no longer exists, and other learned bodies. This is a beautiful quote. Behavioural science brings rigour and discipline to intervention, that's public health intervention. Design, development, evaluation. They use explicit theories and models which underpin these interventions, like a non-smoking campaign or something. Provide cumulative evidence base of what works. Behavioural social scientists, valuable research, methodological skills, lead to new avenues for public health, such as the ability to use large data sets to inform practice. This suggests to me that AI, by all means, used correctly, is really part of this toolbox, surely a very positive thing. But hypothetical, and this is very intuitive, and I may be talking complete rubbish, but there's something in the back of my mind which is thinking, I think it's correct to look at the data that's coming out from social sciences, from their research. For me, it has another kind of quality than compared to the pharmaceutical data when you're testing a drug. It's another quality. I don't even have the words for it, but I think there is something very special we have to look at. if we're using data from the social science research methodologies and outputs, and I do think it exposes particular challenges for the application of AI compared to physical health, medical data. This is very hypothetical, but I think there's something we need to look at. So the next part is to look at these famous conditions that in fact Helen already introduced. These conditions that apply differently to different phases of AI development application. I mean, we've got about 50, 100 different guidelines for AI, very general. What we'd say, I suppose, the horizontal principles, where we're going. Helen's introduced them beautifully. I won't go through them because you've looked at them. Technical robustness, safety. I've tried to highlight things which I think are especially important, or where we've got to perhaps think about how social science research data might need to be looked at. Training data to develop an AI system is up to date, high quality. That's easy because social sciences have very, very good methodologies and representative of the environment the system will be deployed in. Standard things, but I think it's something that social scientists need to get on board. Respect for human agency. Use of AI must look at human agency. We've already covered that. Autonomy, dignity, freedom. But I think social sciences are so valuable because they're the people that can really look at these factors, aren't they? These conditions we've said for AI. The social sciences, together with philosophy, really, really, really are vital to make sure that these much quoted conditions of trustworthy AI actually exist. Explainability is something we're all aware of, the reasoning behind decisions. This is something that I think the social scientists, because of your descriptive normative thing, I think you have a natural ability to be able to do that actually. I think really, I begin to think more and more that a lot of AI people can learn from social scientists. I quite agree. And I think it's something we're underestimating and need to do a lot more work in. I won't go any more. Diversity, non-discrimination, fairness. That is, again, precisely the kind of input and understanding that I think social scientists, their research, need to bring to the AI table to make sure that everything's beneficial. Now, I'm just going to look at a few examples of AI in public health. So we've got, for me, AI, health, public health, social research, where they merge and meet in practice. COVID, I mean, it's taught me a lot, COVID. I mean, it sounds very, I don't mean that in a negative way, but it really has. Things we knew, we now super know, if you know what I mean. You know, these simple facts. COVID mortality rate higher amongst unvaccinated people. Why don't people get vaccinated? Vaccination rates are lower among some groups. I mean, incredibly complex set of determinants. And that's why we need, you know, complex social data analysis is helpful. AI can assist us, but only if we understand causalities and are really driven by the best scientists around. This is a very interesting document from OECD, and it's talking about AI applications, different stages of COVID. And I looked at this and I thought, well, where should social scientists be involved? Were they involved? Are we involving them? And it's quite interesting where you think detection, early warning, possibly not so much. Prediction, this is really important, the prediction box, where we know that people's probability of infection is so much, whether they're poor or not, whether they're disadvantaged, where they work, their background. We need this urgently. Delivery, perhaps not so much. Monitoring, perhaps not so much. Diagnosis, perhaps not so much. Surveillance, I think that's another area where we really need the social scientists, particularly to think what's going to be acceptable to society. Because for me, listening to that, I'm addicted. I have a new addiction, the COVID inquiry. And I think we all know that how a society is designed, built, how we are, how things work, indefinable things about our values and our history determine whether interventions will be accepted or not, and compliance. It's a very interesting but sad science. And again there, you know, if we're going to do monitor and track and trace, how are we going to accept it? Do people? And I think that's why also it's interesting to look at the different interventions that people did around the world. And people don't, you've got to look at the culture, you've got to, you know, somewhere that's an ex-communist country, I lived in Prague under the communists for years, they will have an automatic easiness perhaps to accept some necessarily strict things. Korea, again, and I have a lot of respect for these countries, whereas we in England, good old Boris, his sort of liberality, which is great. It's a value that works well in many contexts, not always. But I say this kind of thing, I think social science, vital. Of course, the final box, information, personalised news, content, the misinformation, I do think that's obviously an area where the social sciences, using AI, can really make a big difference. An area where I think it's very interesting, looking at AI, big data, social research, is behavioural government and use of the behavioural sciences. And as we all know, COVID-19, it was a lot about behavioural change and placing significant psychological burden on individuals, etc. There's a kind of thing that we're all familiar with. And I do think if you look at this task of behavioural sciences, I do think AI, if we treat it very carefully and avoid bias and make sure that the data, etc., I do think there's a win to be made there. Another thing I'm intrigued by, ethically, philosophically, is using nudges. I did a presentation about nudging a while ago. The morality of nudging, and when can a state nudge us? A nudge is kind of, where you're really through the media, through words you're using, how you present yourself when you're giving a speech. It's a thick continuum of nudging, a health intervention, stop smoking, whatever, wear your mask. It's a continuum. There's encourage, influence, pressure, persuade, manipulate, shove, depending on your knowledge of behavioural sciences. A nudge fueled by big data. If you can target people, etc., can easily become more of a solid push or a shove that's hard to withstand. We're getting into social engineering. Is this okay? Does the end always justify the means? If it's a state doing it's different from a commercial company, I would say yes. But these are really areas where I think the social science analysis, knowledge of society is absolutely vital. Nudging ethical issues, freedom of thought and action under threat in a big data AI nudging digital age, democracy risk being undermined, nudging as paternalism, someone knows better. Somebody did know better that wearing a COVID mask was a very good idea. And of course, the interesting thing about public health is that it's one of the few instances where you are obliged sometimes, legally and morally, to go against what the individual wants to protect the majority. So, it is really a battlefield, public health, where the community has to come first, above the individual. Within, obviously, it's always a weighing up, and this, I think, makes the area very challenging. Vaccine hesitancy. I think I lost some friends during the. I don't know. It was so difficult, and I think social science research, perhaps AI can help with this kind of thing. Not so sure whether we understand the causalities enough, but I think it's worth looking at. Why were people vaccine hesitant? We all looked at all the data, and how can you design interventions which are fair, just, and not unjust and unfair, and just downright rude and upsetting people? And I think, again, it's an area, data, AI, social scientist, looking at the health outcomes. There's a new area of work, I think, which could be productive. One of my final points, we've just had a few weeks ago, we did a presentation with Chris Whitty a few days ago. We've got the new idea to stop smoking with kids, intriguing idea. And they've got 70 million stop smoking services interventions. And I'm trying to make the point, please, 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 can we make sure that the interventions to stop smoking, these will be advertising campaigns probably, a lot in social media, that they are designed talking to the social scientists, talking to the experts to make sure that the money is really making interventions which actually help. AI may help. I think it's an interesting area to bear in mind that makes sure that AI is applied sensibly and not in a biased way. This is, at the moment, just, it is a real thing we're talking about. You've got NHS trying to design really important adverts, public health interventions. You've got on the other side industry. One of the vaping companies recycling for a greener future. They're trying to make themselves green. It really is a contested area where I think we've got to harness AI, if it's useful, to make sure we design interventions which really can change society justifiably for the better and stop kids smoking. Okay, so these are my concluding reflections. So I started off by going, yeah, of course it's good. AI, social sciences, data. It's much more complex than I thought. Some of my thinking is to say it's intuitive in a way. There's something in my tummy which is saying, we need more work about this. Social research never been more important in public health than it is now because of the knowledge we've got. AI has the potential to be a useful tool, I think. Much more multidisciplinary work is needed to consider this. I don't know whether we might even need specific guidance aimed at social scientists. I'm not so sure, but I do think it's a very special area where we do well to think about it, not jumping to make guidelines just for the sake of it. And of course, the most important thing is the complexity is horrendous. There are different uses of AI at different phases of the social research process and also in public health interventions, and we need to analyse that. I think that's my last slide. The last one is completely... I wanted a help call links to Turing, and I've got one. Because I think these are really important thoughts, and I think it's really important that Turing... You're obviously on the ball anyway. So that's all I have to say. I hope it was of some interest and use.
Thank you very much. So, as a reminder that there is, I think, never easy answers to the questions that we seek to answer. So, finally, I'll hand over to, behind me, Andy Banks from the ONS, who's the lead data scientist at the Data Science Campus.
Thanks a lot. So yeah, I'm a lead data scientist. If you're not aware of the Data Science Campus was introduced about 6 years ago with the aim of helping the Office for National Statistics use new tools and technology to improve both the operations and to help drive actionable insights in government through using big data and data science tools and techniques to produce statistics and analysis. So I'm hoping that I can kind of bring a view in terms of how AI and in particular new developments in generative AI can help a public sector organisation, but also in terms of opportunities it could bring, but also some kind of practical challenges and risks that we've kind of been learning whilst looking at implementing these types of tools and technology in our work. So I think, as with my fellow presenters, I think the conclusion is very similar in that there is certainly a potential for lots of the potential for benefit, but there is a real need for us to focus on the kind of the risks and that the kind of data ethics, security, and legal considerations are there. And I think the common term of multidisciplinary teams, I think, is really important. So before I start, I think it would be amiss of me to not start with a chart. And it's worth saying that the Office for National Statistics are doing an ongoing programme of work to monitor and track the adoption of AI, both in the economy and in kind of civil society. So this chart here is a survey based on a survey of businesses that looks at divided by industry adoption of various kind of tools and technology relating to AI. I'm very, very conscious of what Helen's been saying around kind of the challenges around kind of collecting this information. I will take some notes and think about that as we back to the ONS. But I think what's interesting here is that around 1 in 6 businesses said that they had adopted at least some form of AI, which I did initially think was actually quite low based on that being kind of September to October, but a huge variation across industries, and really interestingly quite high in the education industry. I mean, the other interesting sort of trend is that you see on the left-hand bar, these are kind of text generation using large language models, and you can already see that as being higher in terms of adoption than some of the more kind of traditional AI or machine learning elements that kind of have been around for much longer, and I think that reflects this kind of the much wider adoption and take up at a really fast rate than some other technologies recently. And I think if you look at, we also survey public perceptions, and interestingly, around 50% have said that they are now using AI to some extent on a day-to-day basis, which is really interesting, and I think could be something to track. But what about adoption in the public sector? Well, we've received lots of, there's been a lot of work going on in government around establishing guidance, principles. And I think the general consensus is that that guidance is cautious but permissive. And I think there is some really great work which is being done by National Cybersecurity Centre and the Central Digital and Data Office around the risks, the guardrails and things that need to be in place when you're thinking about adopting AI or generative AI in organisations. What have we done in the ONS? We have clearly one of our a key objective is transparency, focus on kind of data ethics, data security. So we're similarly taking a kind of cautious step in this area. We want to exploit and explore the benefits, but we want to do that in a way that's really that's cautious. So what we have done is we've set up a kind of cross-organisation pilot where we are looking at how AI and generative, especially generative AI, could be used in different forms of the organisation, and actually using tests and trials of that to kind of explore how what some of the risks are and what some of the limitations are. I'm going to cover a couple of areas. I think there is a role potentially for in the data collection and statistics production space through kind of improving how we process qualitative information and code assistance, which I think is a really big one. Internal processes, a lot of in public sector organisations, a lot of summarising and gathering or searching internal and external information. I think there's potentially a role there. And on communication as well, in terms of improving how we disseminate information to our users. So starting on dissemination, I imagine a number of you in this room use the ONS website on a regular basis, and we're well aware that the website could be improved. And I give an example here of where there's good reason for that. It's really challenging in some way because we produce a huge amount of information on a daily basis. We produce both data, analysis, and methodology articles. There's a need to be able to provide that to people freely with low latency. And so it is really challenging to be able to get that right. But large language models can potentially help. And it's important to do that. It's important to try and explore this because how users access our information is really important. We have produced statistics on how many people have watched the King's coronation, but it was in a very specific bulletin, at a very specific point in time, in a very specific paragraph. So our current website doesn't pick it up, and I don't think users would really be able to know where it is. So we have developed a prototype tool which uses large language models to be able to pick that out. And this uses a combination, this basically uses our entire website, chunks that up into hundreds of thousands of different context blocks, uses a combination of embedding search and generative question answering to basically get an answer out and link to that. So you can see the kind of the power of these sorts of tools in being able to kind of improve the user experience and improve access to information, which I think we all agree is really important. But in designing that, I think we had some really key things in mind. So the first thing is that this, the code to do that is all open source, and we utilised purely open source models, and we made that information publicly available. And I think that's really important for us because of what's been said around the need for transparency of information, and kind of thinking about kind of bias and accuracy. This is particular is secure design, so this does not, because it's using open source models, it's your prompt and your processing never leaves ONS infrastructure, so this doesn't go off to a server in the US. And I'll just have some reflections on kind of going from prototype to production with this. So in principle, I think prototype this is potentially possible, but there are lots of challenges in actually getting that into something which is people can use on mass. I mean, one is just from an infrastructure perspective. These sort of tools are really computationally expensive, and so if you wanted to have lots of people being able to query this and use this at low cost, at low latency, something needs to give. There needs to be a trade-off, and that comes at the cost of computing power. And so we have had to think really carefully about how you actually deploy tools and large language models, tools like this to the masses. Essentially, it needs strong kind of multidisciplinary working with cloud infrastructure engineers. Another thing is the clarity of message to the user. So we initially kind of had this model where we said, here's your question and what's the most likely answer, but we're actually going to remove that. And the reason is because the phrasing and the kind of the signaling of what these tools can and can't do to users is really important. So we're actually changing this so it's much more about looking like a traditional search engine where contexts are kind of highlighted instead. So I think kind of when you're designing or building these sorts of tools, I think the messaging to the user is really important. And then obviously accuracy of results. So if this was ever to be moved into for others to be using, it would need to be obviously 100% accurate. And with large language models, doing that is really tricky. There's obviously the propensity to hallucinate and prompt injection as well. And we've designed and so the key message I'd say from this is that the design of the system is really important. We've managed to design this system in a way that guarantees that text that the Office for National Statistics have produced is relayed back. So it's directly quoting text from that, and it does that actually by removing kind of a dependency on the large language model through and more kind of traditional string matching techniques. So the key thing is that the design of the system is crucially important, and we would advocate that you do not kind of rely on the results from a large language model if you want to guarantee accuracy. So another point is on kind of collection and processing. We've used machine learning quite widely in kind of processing of statistics, but I wanted to kind of give an example again of where kind of large language models can be fairly powerful. In the Office for National Statistics, you know, you'll be aware that we kind of collect a lot of qualitative information through kind of survey that involves free text. And we have had challenges in the past around kind of categorizing or classifying that free text to kind of a standard classification. And we've utilized really quite complex, processes to kind of try and deal with this, and you've also got a logistic regression model which can kind of do some of these other sorts of elements. But the pace of change in these sorts of tools has been really amazing. We actually realized that you can conceptually create a custom GPT, which was kind of released a couple of weeks back, to sort of do this kind of activity. And you can use a kind of few-shot classification style approach to kind of categorize free text into, in this case, a SIC and SOC code. And I did this actually whilst walking my dog in an hour. And so these tools are becoming incredibly powerful. And what we found is that actually something like this using GPT-4 is much better at kind of than a more complex logistic regression approach, picking out its context, sentiment, things like that. So it's incredibly powerful, and in some ways you could say it is incredibly accurate. But there are some real concerns and problems around kind of implementing this more widely. One of them, obviously, is there being a kind of black box and lack of interpretability and things like that. So I think they'll just make the point there that, again, the same kind of principle applies, that there's a huge pace of change. It's really quite powerful. There could be potential use cases, but there's some concerns there. And in terms of improving collection, there's some very, very initial thinking around how conversation agents could potentially be used to, with a user respondent to, say, an online survey or an online questionnaire, to try and improve the quality of response that person gives. So that might be rephrasing a question, it might be doing some kind of follow-up questioning or something like that. So again, I'm not saying that is something that we would necessarily want to implement, but is some interesting thinking about how it could potentially affect or transform collection. But in terms of processing, we in the Office of National Statistics, we do a lot of data processing. There's a huge potential for the use of code assistance tools and things like that for supporting our kind of software engineers and analysts. Again, I would say these come with caveats. We did an internal test of these sorts of tools with some of our data scientists and software engineers, and there were some real benefits in terms of speed of completing tasks and things like that. But we found that for more junior analysts, that was a kind of there was a kind of a risk that the answer that was being given, or the kind of the answer was being given, or the suggested text was not kind of critiqued enough, or was not kind of actually was taken more at face value, and that then led to kind of problems further down the line. So I personally use these tools and find them very helpful for my own kind of productivity, but I do think that they should come with kind of clear risks and caveats. And then finally, on internal operations, I mentioned kind of, from an organisational perspective, there's always a lot of kind of summarising of information, both externally and internally, and also there's a clear need to kind of get good access to guidance and the right guidance that's there. So one thing we've looked at is whether, again, a kind of conversation agent or this kind of concept of retrieval augmented generation, the idea of being able to kind of search and query large bodies of documents, can kind of help internal operations. So this on the right-hand side is a kind of chatbot that allows a kind of employee in the ONS to kind of ask questions relating to kind of internal policies, say around, in this case it was around whether you can change your home office location, so this is around kind of HR guidance. Again, kind of really, really powerful. I think some of these tools have only been really released in the last sort of 2 months or 2 or 3 months, and they are improving kind of on a weekly basis. It is quite kind of staggering. But I think that the key point I kind of wanted to introduce here was that in this instance, you really want to ensure that the advice that is being given is 100% accurate again. So kind of going back to that accuracy. So how can you kind of ensure that that's happening, while still kind of potentially utilising the kind of the power of these tools. And I think there is really leads to an emerging interest in kind of conversation agents with a human in the loop. So kind of so it's like sounds like a bit of a dichotomy, but it actually, the principle is that you might have people who would be kind of answering calls or kind of reviewing cases, who would actually be kind of trying hard to kind of search and retrieve all the right information and finding that difficult and time consuming, might be able to kind of make use of a tool which kind of recommends an answer or provides more clearer access and guidance to kind of that answer. And then the person can kind of look to accept, edit, or reject the answer. And there are actually some really interesting tools out there where you can kind of integrate this in with messaging apps through messaging app APIs. So you can actually have someone engaging with a user, looking and reviewing a kind of suggested answer, and then there. So that's kind of one way in which you would kind of practically have a human in the loop, whilst also kind of potentially utilising some of these benefits. Again, I think that's helpful where accuracy is paramount. I'm going to cover quickly risks. The key risks are obviously prompt injection and hallucination. I've given an example here on the right where a recruitment agency built a Twitter bot based on GPT-4 that basically tried to promote its own company when people tweeted about remote work. And it turned out that was incredibly easy to have prompt injection. With the Twitter bot kind of extending offers of jobs kind of to people just based on kind of simple prompt injection techniques. That's kind of quite a humorous example, but there is a really significant security risk, especially if large language models that are kind of enabling web browsing, you're utilising that. Because people can be put malicious statements in their website and retrieve data through API calls. So, and then the other thing is around kind of unconstrained context leading to hallucination. So I give kind of the example of stats chat. We are very careful to design the system and how the large language model is engaged with to ensure that there is nothing that is being said from that model that is not directly quoted within the ONS website. How can you kind of ensure that? My view is that good system design and human in the loop is essential. There are other alternatives which can kind of perversely include more AI. So this concept of AI chaining and using AI to check that the initial AI has kind of done its job. I'm a little bit skeptical of that and kind of concerned. And then kind of, I'll just final slide on here around the ethics and risks. I think a lot of this has been covered already, but the key risks there are transparency, fairness, bias, and discrimination. I think some of the key mitigation strategies for me, I would say, are to use open source where it's possible, and clearly state and cite your sources and bias tests. So actually a lot of these models that are publicly available, they do have the underlying training data set that's used. And they do have their own tests, but you can carry out your tests on that training data set as well. So, and I would recommend that that's done, and there are tools out there to kind of do that. I've covered kind of semi-automated, human-in-the-loop kind of solutions. Again, you can kind of do programmatic tests of and kind of data-led tests of bias, but it's clear that human quality assurance is clearly the best for kind of establishing that. And I'll finish, I guess, with that kind of conclusion. So I do think there is lots of scope for these sorts of tools, especially with the pace of improvement and their accessibility, to make an impact and transform elements of how public sector organisations work. But I will leave with the UKSA Ethical Principle 3, which does say that the risks and limits need to be considered, and that there is sufficient human oversight, and that your methods and the way you're thinking about deploying these sorts of tools need to have recognised standards of integrity and quality, which I think is a good way of kind of phrasing it, and is certainly what we're thinking about when we're doing any work in this space. So I'll leave there.
Thank you very much. If I could ask all our speakers to take their chair, and I believe there is a roving mic. If I could just check with my RSS colleagues, my understanding is that the recording will only pick up voices from the mic, is that right? So if the whole room, okay, so there's no need, I was wrong before, so there's no need to have to stand up for questions. So if I could take hands for questions. Well, just to let you know, we'll do about 10 minutes of questions before, I know we're running a bit late, but I want to make some time for those. If I could ask you when you get the mic, if you could just give your name, please, and say where you're from, and if you're addressing it to any one person in particular or the whole panel. Pardon? Yeah, we should still try to use that. Okay.
Hello, I'm Cathie Metzler from SAGE. My question is for you, Helen. I wondered if you could give us a flavor of what the other lecture would have been on what you think AI can do for social research.
Are we taking a few questions, or do you want to?
We'll just take one at a time, I think.
Yes, well, I mean, the trouble is, AI has come to mean absolutely everything now, or at least it's been through a phase of meaning absolutely everything. So for a while there, it came to mean anything that was statistics, anything, it would come even to mean like a regression was being called AI by some people. And I think it's really important to, when you're thinking about doing good social science, actually AI is supposed to be something more distinctive than that. It's become a sort of word for data science, really, but then it's included kind of all the latest things. And then there was a period where it just became ChatGPT, and everyone was just, when people talk about AI, they meant ChatGPT. And the kind of social science we do at the Turing and also OII, I mean, we are using these things as kind of, it's very helpful to have some kind of large language model to start your model when you're doing some modelling work, for example, on, say, online harm detection and measurement. But then you would build on that. You wouldn't just rely on it. You wouldn't just, I mean, I wouldn't call that really social science, I don't think. So I think it's much more, I don't want to call it a chatbot because people, technologists really hate that. But I mean, it's a virtual assistant, and I think that is how the leading, really, and of course, large language models are a kind of easier virtual assistant to use. But all the way along, you know, machine learning has just been an extension of other methods. But I suppose if you were going to say what is it really good for, I mean, I would say that it is good for it's good for detection and measurement. It's good for prediction, and in a governmental context, that's important because policymakers have generally been pretty rubbish at that. I'm talking about the things that it's kind of newly good for compared with just, say, earlier statistical methodologies. And the point I made about simulation, you know, we've had agent computing models forever, but until they had decent amounts of data, they're pretty rubbish, and as soon as they came across the real world, they kind of fell to bits. But to have actual simulation where you can test out a policy, there's a point you made earlier about kind of, there's an article in the American Political Science Review saying that social science isn't rocket science, it's more complicated. And I think some of these things, you know, sometimes social science doesn't work. These models don't work for social science. There's been various sorts of sort of digital twins, you know, models of the social world. well, dream on, you know. For specific things it can work. I guess our labour mobility model is it's a model to be able to simulate some kind of intervention on. And I think that can work. Yeah. But some kind of overall digital twin of the social world, I feel, it's a pipe dream.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Hi there, Karen Clapson from the General Medical Council. Actually, collaborating with the Turing Institute at the moment on a survey which launched yesterday of doctors, so just putting that out there. I just wondered about Stephen Fry's metaphor, so sorry to kind of pick on you for starting it off. I mean, obviously a tsunami is a very negative thing. You know, what do you do in the face of a tsunami? You maybe run to high ground, try and find shelter. I wondered, I mean, is that the metaphor that we should be thinking of when thinking of AI? I mean, is it, you know, Frankenstein's monster? Is it, you know, Mickey Mouse struggling with the kind of demons that he's summoned up through in Fantasia, you know, through magic? What would be your kind of go-to metaphor for thinking about AI? What is this kind of image or something that brings? And so that's a question to anybody. And you don't, maybe you need a minute or two to think that through. I don't know.
Well, I'm certainly not going to answer. I know I said it, but I'm going to pass over to yes, Nicola.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, you can just speak here.
Okay.
We've got a mic.
I mean, funnily enough, I was with Stephen Fry a couple of weeks ago and he told this story. And he's an absolute poppet. But he was invited to talk at CogX. And it drives me mad, actually. Because I think it's completely inappropriate. It really makes me quite disappointed for a brilliant person, actually. I don't think it's very constructive. I mean, AI, it's a piece of string, isn't it? And people are acting as though it's all out of our hands. I mean, I remember the same mess about nanosciences about 10 years ago when it ruled my life, working with the nanoscientists. And you've got to be very careful. Nobody's determined that. But the power is in our hands to say what we're going to do with it. So this kind of thing, I think, is really actually, it's encouraging a hysteria. It reminds me of the use of the internet today and vaccine hesitancy for hysteria and misinformation. And I think it's quite depressing. I would say it's something exciting. We've got to watch it. We've got to keep control. When I teach AI ethics in my research, I say I do not accept a black box. Do not come to me with a black box. No, because it's clear it's not okay to have a black box. We must be able to understand. And if we have the guts to actually say that, it can be largely good, can't it? Or am I being a bit naive?
Well, no, I mean, I get particularly annoyed in my own discipline of political science because technology in general was completely ignored for donkey's years. I wrote my PhD about computer systems in government. And at the time, that was a very sad and lonely thing to do in the 1990s. I mean, literally nobody was interested. And then the internet came along and people sort of got a bit interested, but it wasn't real politics. And I could show you, 100 quotes of either politicians or political scientists saying, yeah, but that's not real politics that you can do in your pajamas. And they were still arguing up, the Arab Spring came along and it was like, oh yes, but the civil rights movement would never have happened on social media. Then we had, the revolution in Tunisia. They were still saying that, And then suddenly from that, public commentators jumped to saying, but it's ruined everything. And it's like, I'm like, how did that happen? I've been looking at this stuff for years. I've been trying to help the public sector and the academy kind of think about the positives here for governance, for democracy, for all the things that I care about. How did it happen? But to manage the risks, which is what the ethics are, to manage the risk, confront the risk, develop frameworks. That was the whole point of our ethical frameworks that we developed at the beginning of the programme. Because at least half of the people we spoke to in the policy-making world were saying, yes, but what should we do? It was a barrier. They were worried about what they should do, and some of them with good reason. But, I mean, you have to confront like that. Any technology is dangerous. I think Stephen Fry should read Heidegger.
Tells me. I think we've got time for one more question.
Yeah, Siobhan Carey, former government analyst. A question for all three of you. You've also mentioned about the multidisciplinarity of it. And certainly my experience from when everyone suddenly was going digital. The only thing that was sexy in government was digital. Getting a seat at the table became very difficult. I mean, Helen, you've particularly talked about sort of what are the skills that are missing. What's your sort of assessment of the current openness of social scientists to engage with AI and AI technologists to engage with social science?
Well, it's better than it was. There have been about 400, well, we didn't measure it last year, but the year before, there have been about 400 government publications and press releases that mentioned AI. And I do think there's a sense in which AI is sort of bringing policymakers and social scientists together in ways that perhaps hasn't happened for a while. Government always goes in phases of the attention it pays to the academy and to social science in particular. And I think, there is a tendency to be more interested in other sorts of, in the STEM disciplines, to feel that that's real science. And sometimes that's social scientists' fault. I think we're very bad at showing to, at actually going to policymakers and saying, how can we help? The whole point of the public policy programme was, how can we help? And they really wanted, there is far, far more that we could do if we had the resources. Although I'm so happy we're working on your survey, because that is so interesting. But there's so much more we could do. There is a really, really a lot of demand. So that's a kind of positive thing to say, but still way to go.
Yeah, what I've found in our work is that we've, over the last sort of 6-9 months, we've really found that there's a need to, right at the outset, bring lots of different parties from a range of different disciplines together to kind of respond to these kind of, to the new developments in technology. So bringing the whole risk management function in the organisation together right at the outset, data ethics, kind of security, legal, that actually being, working together as part of a project team right at the outset is absolutely critical, because when you're dealing with these kind of rapid improvements or rapid changes in technology, the key thing I think is to try and be proactive and understand what your principles are and where you and actually have a broad range of views in terms of kind of establishing that and making sure that those kind of guardrails are in place from all different perspectives.
Could I just make one point to that? I think sometimes it is social science's fault, because social science doesn't really have an identity. I'm being very unusual here in saying, I'm a social scientist kind of thing. We have political science, we have sociology, we have economics, we have psychology, and mostly those people don't talk to each other. And that makes it very difficult for policymakers. They don't want to get in some kind of spat about what's good economics or good political science. And I think one thing we have managed to do, which I think is important, and is really, I've really thought about this when I think what's worked, is to sort of do the disciplinary wiring at the back end. I'm a political scientist, my co-director's an economist, we've got sociologists, psychologists, but we don't sort of force that on people. We just say, here's the sort of thing we need you to do and the kind of questions you need to ask and that kind of thing. And I think that is a lesson, that's a lesson for me as a social scientist. Don't be all kind of protective of your own tribe, but try and be in a bigger, more general sort of tribe.
I do think that COVID and the facts we knew and didn't want to look at about the injustice and the inequalities in the country and how vital it is. This has opened the door, I think, for at least in the public health, for a huge focus. So I think it really is an open door, because now we realise the disparities and absolutely shocking things that came out. I think the door's open, and I suppose it depends possibly on the government as to whether we walk through it or not. We certainly need to do a huge amount more research in the public health, social sciences, AI field. And who's going to finance it, I suppose? Because most of my work's international. I think a lot of countries have got the same problem. I don't think it's an English thing. But I think the door is certainly opened if we can go through it.
Okay, just for the sake of time, apologies, sir. I'm going to call a halt to the Q&A. First of all, I'd just like to thank our speakers very much.